Are all one's venial sins forgiven in confession, even if he does not confess them all?
Well, venial sins don't need to be absolved, okay? They can be forgiven because of our charity. If we perform an act of charity, an alms giving of alms or whatever, a sacrifice we make, a prayer, we can have venial sins forgiven by these things. So the act of going to confession and receiving sacramental absolution, doing our penance and so on, that can absolve all of the venial sins we have. Problem is, if we come away from a confession and we still have an attachment to venial sins, that's problematic. If I, for example, were to go to confession and confess that I had committed fraud, defrauded my company of $100,000, it would be a mortal sin. And I would could be forgiven as long as I was truly repentant and had the intention to make restitution. But let's say I do come away with that intention to reform all of my mortal sins. I have resolved to fight against the temptations to all mortal sins and avoid the occasions of them if I possibly can. So I had a firm purpose of amendment, true contrition for my mortal sins. But I can still come away from that confession, let's say, with a bad temper, kind of a complacency with that. I can say, well, that's just the way I am. I'm choleric, people just have to put up with it. And I do not have any real intention to overcome that bad temper and the damage it does, the scandal it might cause, and so on. Now, would all venial sins of that particular type be forgiven? Not if I still have an attachment to a habit of venial sin. So I would have to make a firm purpose of amendment with regard not only to my mortal sins in order to be forgiven those, but I would also have to have a firm purpose of amendment, try to overcome all my habits of venial sin, if I would expect and hope to be forgiven all of those venial sins too.
Father, when one goes to confession, should he confess all of his venial sins when he examines his conscience? He
doesn't have any obligation to do so, and it might be rather cumbersome. If a person was trying to keep track of all of his venial sins, he probably would include in those his faults, and we fall into these things almost reflexively, and it'd be very, very difficult to keep track of those. There's no obligation to confess venial sins. As I say, if one tried to do so and he had tendencies of human nature, the temperaments, do leave us prey to certain tendencies, to laziness, overreaction, anger, gluttony, and so on. It could be that if one was so focused on his venial sins that if he had mortal sins to confess, that one could almost imagine this happening, that they would draw the focus off of the deadly sins that he'd committed. And so the church really wants us to focus on those mortal sins and having a firm purpose of amendment with regard to them. I think it's a good idea to confess certainly some habits of venial sin we have. If someone sees himself committing the same venial sins over and over again, I would recommend that he confess those because he wants to make headway against them. But there's no doubt that the necessary matter of sacramental confession and for absolution is mortal sin. And that should be the primary focus, really, of someone who's guilty of them.
If venial sins don't need to be absolved, why then is it still so important for Catholics to go to confession, even if they don't necessarily have any mortal sins to confess? They've only committed venial sins since their last confession.
Because of the sacramental graces of confession. Let's say, especially in the world today with the temptations virtually everywhere, it's necessary to have the sacramental graces of confession, the sacrament of penance. And so it is highly recommended that somebody who wants to make progress in the spiritual life should go to confession at least once a month, if not more often. That's assuming that they don't have any mortal sins to confess. If they have mortal sins, then they should go to confession as soon as possible. So if someone is guilty of mortal sin, they should seek sacramental absolution as soon as they can, because they want to apologize to God as soon as they can and return to the state of grace as soon as possible. With venial sin and habits of venial sin, it's necessary to, as it were, keep our focus on the effort to overcome them. Remember, venial sin does weaken the soul, and it does weaken the soul's love for God. For those who love God, that in itself is unacceptable. They're not okay with loving God less. They want to love him more, because their love for him is genuine. They want to overcome their habits of venial sin because they know that those habits of venial sin not only weaken their love for God and perhaps threaten their love for God, leaving them vulnerable to temptation, but those habits of venial sin can also give scandal, very bad example, and prove a real heavy cross for those who have to live with them. So all the more reason why they want to seriously focus on overcoming them. And sacramental confession is a very important way to do that.